Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Igor Harrison had never believed in the power of tenderness. Since early childhood, he had learned to protect himself from the world by building walls around his heart. His childhood home in Chicago was nothing but a cold shell, marked by the shadow of his absent and failing parents. His father, Richard Harrison, was a taciturn and distant man, lost in alcohol and endless nights. He preferred to drown his own failures in glasses of whiskey rather than guide his children. As for his mother, Evelyn, she had been a ghostly presence, engulfed by poverty, alcohol, and despair. She had left behind an invisible but profound trace, that of a love Igor had never received and did not know how to reclaim. The neighborhood where Igor grew up was a maze of damp alleys and tightly packed houses, reminiscent of poverty and neglect. The air was heavy, saturated with smoke, the smell of burnt food, and dust. Children's laughter was rare, drowned out by the cries of adults struggling against a world that seemed to have forgotten them. Hunger, cold, loneliness, all of this formed the daily life of this young boy, who learned early on that life was no picnic. To survive, Igor had learned to keep quiet, to ignore the pain, to hide his tears in silence. He had never known what security was, the warmth of a home, or even the certainty that someone loved him. Caresses, sweet words, encouragement, all of these were forbidden to him, relegated to a world he had not left. The nights were long and silent, lulled only by the screams of neighbors and the uneven breathing of his parents, prisoners of their own disasters. Despite this childhood marked by suffering, Igor had found refuge in ambition. He had sworn that one day he would leave these stifling streets and build a life where poverty and pain could never reach him. He had clung to school, to work, to success, building a wall between himself and his past, stone by stone. And he had succeeded. Years of relentless struggle had made him a prosperous, respected, wealthy, and admired man. But behind this mask of success still hid an abandoned boy, a prisoner of his memories and the loneliness that had always accompanied him. That day, however, everything changed. His daughters, Emily and Sophie, joyful and carefree, had taken him for a walk through the city streets. They were unaware of the depth of their father's wounds and simply wanted to share a moment of complicity. And then they showed him, their innocent and light curiosity, a beggar sitting on the sidewalk, her body stooped, her clothes worn, her face marked by years of misery. Igor stopped dead in his tracks. A cold shiver ran down his spine. His eyes fixed on that fragile, broken figure, and he saw in her gaze something familiar, terribly familiar. It was the face of his mother, Evelyn, but transformed by poverty and years of neglect. The same tired expression, the same melancholy, the same silent pain that he had seen once, but amplified, exacerbated by time. At that moment, all the barriers he had built around his heart collapsed. Repressed memories gushed forth like an uncontrollable torrent, the smell of damp floors, the muffled cries of his youth, the hunger, the fear, the absence of love. The beggar wasn't just a woman on the street. She was the mirror of his past, the reflection of everything he had run away from and tried to ignore. And for the first time in decades, Igor felt vulnerable, scared, but also alive. The past had caught up with him, brutal and relentless, and he knew he could never ignore it again. That day, on that unremarkable Chicago street, success, wealth, and power seemed paltry against the inexorable force of his memories and buried wounds. The gray light of late morning bathed the busy Chicago street. Igor Harrison walked alongside his two daughters, Emily and Sophie, taking advantage of the stroll to share a rare moment of family tranquility. 16-year-old Emily had inherited her father's bright, curious eyes, while 12-year-old Sophie possessed a mix of sweetness and mischief, always ready to question the world around her. Everything seemed ordinary until Emily stopped dead in her tracks, pointing at something on the sidewalk. "Look, Dad," she said with the innocence of her age. "That woman, she looks lost." Igor followed her gaze, and suddenly his breath caught. Sitting there, in a threadbare old coat, her face lined by life and deprivation, was a beggar woman. But it wasn't just her poverty that struck him, it was her gaze, deep and melancholy, and the uncanny resemblance to his own mother. a cold shiver ran down his spine, and his heart seemed to stop for a moment. The woman had the same tired features, the same expression of suffering and resignation, but distorted by years of misery and abandonment. Igor froze, unable to utter a word. Sophie, carefree, gently tugged at his sleeve. "Dad, are you coming to see? She looks so sad." Igor looked away slightly, trying to compose himself, but the image of his mother invaded every corner of his memory. He saw Evelyn, once full of life, slowly fading under the weight of poverty and hardship. Memories flooded his mind, the damp floors of their childhood home, the oppressive silence of his parents, the nights spent waiting for a gesture of love that never came. "Emily, Sophie, stay close to me," he said, his voice lower than he intended, a tremor betraying his emotion. His daughters, sensitive to this sudden change, moved closer, silent and attentive. Igor knelt gently before the woman, feeling her hands tremble slightly. His eyes, fixed on hers, searched for a clue, a sign of recognition. "Mom," he whispered almost imperceptibly, as if afraid that saying the word would break reality. The beggar woman slowly raised her eyes, meeting his. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. There was a flash of awareness, a flash of recognition, or perhaps simply the surprise of being seen. Igor felt a fragile connection form between them, a tenuous but powerful thread that brought him back to the child he had been, to all the wounds he had buried beneath years of success and apparent indifference. Emily finally broke the silence, naive but full of kindness. "Dad, do you want to give her something to eat? I don't think she's had anything to eat in a long time." Igor nodded slowly, still unable to speak. For the first time in years, he felt a strange mixture, fear, guilt, but also a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this encounter, so unexpected, would be the beginning of a confrontation with the past he had always tried to escape. Hesitantly, he reached out and gently placed a few bills in the beggar's hand. The contact, small but real, triggered a cascade of emotions within him. The poverty he had always ignored, the pain he had repressed, his mother's face, lost in the shadows of the years, it was all there, present and inevitable. And in that suspended moment, Igor understood that his life had just changed. This innocuous encounter would awaken memories, pains, and truths that he was no longer able to ignore. Igor's breathing was uneven, as if he had just plunged into an abyss from which he thought he had long since escaped. His eyes remained fixed on the beggar, and every detail of her face seemed to trigger a flood of memories. The resemblance to his mother, Evelyn, was not only in the features, it was in the tired expression, the melancholy, and that same resignation in the face of a cruel world. He saw himself as a child, running through the narrow streets of their poor neighborhood, trying to escape boredom and hunger. The walls of their house were damp, covered in mold, and the air was always heavy, laden with dust and silence. He remembered the nights he had waited alone for his parents to return from their nocturnal escapades, hoping for a gesture of warmth, a word of encouragement, but nothing came. Emptiness surrounded him, an emptiness he had learned to ignore, to camouflage under a shell of silence and indifference. His father, Richard, was a distant and stern man, capable of enormous anger but rarely of affection. Igor remembered the times when the clinking of glasses heralded Richard's flight into alcohol and night, leaving his children alone with fear and cold. And his mother, Evelyn. She had been there physically, but her spirit seemed lost in the shadows of poverty and alcohol. She had become a specter among them, absorbed by her own pain, unable to protect her children or convey any semblance of love. Igor suddenly felt a dull anger, a mixture of sadness and injustice. Why had they been abandoned like this? Why had life left them alone, abandoned to the indifference of overwhelmed parents? These memories, which he had tried to bury under the years of success, now returned with a consuming intensity. Emily and Sophie, still at his side, watched their father with concern. They didn't understand why his face, so often impassive and self-assured, was now tense, and why his hands were trembling slightly. They felt that this beggar was not just another woman on the street, but represented something much deeper, a fragment of their father's past. Igor breathed deeply, trying to regain his composure. But every gesture the beggar made, every shiver in her threadbare coat, brought back the image of Evelyn as he remembered her, a young woman, once full of life, who had finally dissolved into poverty and oblivion. He realized that, despite everything he had built, his wealth, his career, his reputation, he had never healed this absence. His success had never replaced a mother's love, and no amount of accomplishment could fill the void left by a mother lost in pain. Yet amidst this inner turmoil, a fragile feeling emerged: hope. Perhaps this meeting would be a chance to reconcile with his past, to understand what he had lost and why he had always run away. Perhaps by finally facing the truth, he could begin to heal. Igor reached out to the beggar again, more determined this time. Emily and Sophie, realizing that this gesture was important to their father, followed them silently, ready to support and understand, even if they didn't yet know what. And in that suspended moment, Igor Harrison understood that his life had changed. The past he thought buried for decades had resurfaced, and he could no longer run from it. The beggar wasn't just a homeless woman, she was a mirror of everything he had been, everything he had lost, and perhaps, everything he might yet find again. The icy Chicago wind swept gently across the sidewalk, but Igor didn't notice. His attention was entirely captured by the woman sitting in front of him. Every wrinkle, every blemishes on her face seemed to tell a story of pain and abandonment. And through that story, Igor saw the reflection of his mother, Evelyn, whom he hadn't seen in decades. He remembered her young, luminous face, her slender hands, and the tenderness that, at fleeting moments, had crossed her tired eyes. But now, all that had been erased by the years of poverty and loneliness. The beggar woman, with her threadbare coat and matted hair, bore all the traces of the life his mother had led after abandoning him. Igor felt a lump form in his throat. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling, almost inaudible. The beggar woman looked up at him, and in her gaze, he thought he saw a fleeting spark of awareness, as if she understood something only Igor could see. That fragile, silent moment was charged with emotion. Igor felt the weight of all those years of accumulated pain fall back on his shoulders. He remembered the days he tried to understand her as a child. The repeated absences, the broken promises, the silent tears behind closed doors. He'd grown up with a sense of betrayal he'd never been able to express. And now, standing in front of this woman, the past came flooding back with crushing intensity, reminding him of everything he'd tried to run away from. Emily, the older one, looked at her father worriedly. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked softly. Sophie, the younger one, grabbed the sleeve of his coat, seeming to sense that something important was happening. Igor took a deep breath and, for the first time in a long time, allowed his voice to crack slightly. I lost my mother when I was little. I never really found her again." The girls exchanged a look, finally understanding that this was no ordinary encounter. They had never seen their father like this, vulnerable and moved, and they understood that this beggar was much more than just another woman on the street. Igor recalled the times he had tried to fill the void of his childhood with success and money. Every professional victory, every public recognition, everything had been a palliative for his mother's absence. But nothing could replace that lost connection, that maternal warmth he had always sought and that life had denied him. Hesitantly, he reached out his hand and lightly placed it on the beggar's. The contact was minimal, but enough to trigger a wave of memories, regrets, and realizations. He understood then that this encounter was no accident. It was an opportunity to confront everything he had tried to escape, the pain, the guilt, but also the possibility of forgiveness, or at least inner reconciliation. The beggar woman whispered something, barely audible, but enough for Igor to hear a familiar word, an echo from his past, Igor. The name echoed in his mind like a clap of thunder. Was it really her? Was it Evelyn, the mother he had lost and whose absence had shaped his entire life? Or was it simply the reflection of a memory too long repressed, coming to life before him in a shattered form? Igor didn't know yet. But he knew one thing: he had to stay, speak, understand. He had to face this shadow of the past and discover the truth, whatever the cost. The silence of the street seemed to have thickened around Igor. The usual sounds of the city, horns, voices, hurried footsteps, now seemed distant, as if muffled by the intensity of the moment. Igor leaned slightly toward the beggar, his hands still trembling, and tried to pierce the veil of pain that enveloped her face. I don't know if it's you, if it's really you, he whispered, his voice almost foreign to his own ears. But I think you're my mother. The beggar woman, sitting on the sidewalk, slowly turned her head. Her eyes, marked by a fatigue that seemed to weigh down decades, met Igor's. A suspended moment fell. Then, in a weak, almost stifled voice, she murmured, "Igor, my boy." The words, simple and broken, resonated like an echo in the son's heart. Igor felt his legs buckle slightly, his breath catch. Emily and Sophie, behind him, held their breaths, unable to look away. They were seeing their father vulnerable for the first time and understood, even without knowing everything, that this woman was the center of his silent torment. I looked for you," the beggar continued, her voice trembling. "I tried to come back, but," she trailed off, unable to finish her sentence, as if each word cost her a part of her soul. Igor felt a wave of pain and comfort mix within him. The guilt, long repressed, surged forward. Why had she disappeared? Why had she abandoned her children? But alongside this anger, a small glimmer of humanity awoke, the recognition that she was still there, that a fragment of his past remained alive. Emily stepped forward slowly, her voice soft but assured. "Dad. I think she loves you, in a different way. Maybe she didn't know how to show us." Sophie, shaking her sister's hand, added, "We can help him, if you want." Igor let out a shaky breath, the weight of his entire life suddenly resting on this simple gesture from his daughters. He knelt completely, moving closer to the beggar, and whispered, "I never forgot you, Mom. Even when I thought I had lost you forever. I looked for you in every success, every victory. But I looked for you in vain. Until today." A shudder passed between them, as if years of silence and suffering were erased in an instant. The beggar, her eyes bathed in tears, placed her hands on Igor's. The contact, small but charged with emotion, sealed the beginning of a dialogue that words alone could not express. For the first time in decades, Igor felt that the past could be confronted. That forgiveness, or at least understanding, could emerge. And through the eyes of his attentive and supportive daughters, he understood that this broken family bond could perhaps be repaired, that suffering no longer had to be a secret hidden in the shadows. Their hands remained joined for a few moments, time suspended in this fragile but hopeful gesture. Igor understood that this encounter, however painful, marked the beginning of a reconstruction, of a reconciliation with the past and with himself. Silence reigned in the car as Igor drove through the dark city streets. His two daughters, Emily and Sarah, sat in the back, cuddled together, still reeling from the scene they had just witnessed. Their father hadn't said a word since he'd seen the beggar, and his normally closed face looked haunted. "Dad, who was this woman?" Emily asked timidly, her voice almost muffled with tension. Igor didn't answer immediately. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road as if he were fleeing a ghost. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, "It was nobody. Forget what you saw." Sarah frowned. She knew her father, knew when he was lying. Her blue eyes, inherited from him, darkened. "Dad, you knew her." The silence that followed weighed heavily on the car. Igor gritted his teeth, unable to deny it. Images from the past, which he had been trying to bury for years, returned in painful waves. This woman on the street, she wasn't a stranger. She was someone who had left her mark on his history, someone he would have preferred never to see again. When they got home, Sarah refused to go upstairs to bed. She stood in the living room, arms crossed, defying her father with a look. Emily, more gentle, hesitated but eventually joined her sister. "You're hiding something from us," Sarah said. "And we have the right to know." Igor sighed, placed his hands on his knees, and sank into the old leather armchair. The ticking of the clock echoed through the room. "This woman, her name is Anna," he finally whispered. Emily's eyes widened. "Anna? You knew her? Igor nodded slowly. She was part of my life, a long time ago. Long before you were born. The girls exchanged a look. They knew they were touching on a truth their father had always refused to discuss. Sarah approached and knelt before him. Tell us, Dad. Who is she really? Igor stared at his daughters, torn between fear of reawakening wounds and the need for truth. His voice trembled when he finally said, She wasn't just a woman I knew. She was, plus. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. Emily put a hand to her mouth. Their secretive father had just opened a door they weren't sure they could close. And in the heavy silence that followed, a certainty settled in. This beggar was not just a shadow from the past, she was the beginning of a revelation that would shake their entire family. The next morning, Igor got up before his daughters. The memory of the beggar woman, her tired eyes, and that word spoken so faintly, Igor, continued to swirl in his mind. Every step into the house seemed to awaken echoes of the past he thought he had buried forever. He sat in the living room, his coffee cup barely touched, and thought about Anna. She had never been just a woman passing through his life. Anna had been the fragile light of his childhood, the only person capable of giving him a little warmth in an empty home. She had been loving, caring, and above all, present, until the day she disappeared, leaving Igor and his brother alone to face the coldness of a distant father. As the girls got ready for school, Igor felt he had to face the truth. He could no longer hide behind his successes or his masks of strength. Emily and Sarah deserved to know the part of him he had ignored for so long. Girls, he began hesitantly, sit down. There's something I need to tell you. The two girls sat down on the sofa, silent but attentive. The woman you saw yesterday, she wasn't just a beggar. She was someone very important to me. Her name is Anna, and she was my adoptive mother, Igor explained, his voice betraying his emotion. Emily frowned. Your adoptive mother? But you already have a mother, don't you? Igor nodded slowly, clasping his hands in his lap. Yes. My biological mother, Evelyn, she abandoned me and my brother when we were very young. Anna arrived soon after, trying to fill that void, but life's circumstances separated her from us. She disappeared before I could truly thank her or understand what she meant to me. Sarah, her eyes misty, whispered. So, the woman in the street, she's Anna? Yes, Igor said, his voice trembling. It's her. She's lived through years of poverty and hardship, and yet, here she is. After all this time, she's here. A heavy silence fell. The girls now understood that their father carried deep wounds within him, absences that had shaped his character and his way of seeing the world. Igor, for the first time, let his vulnerability show. I've spent my life running from pain, he continued. Running from the emptiness life left inside me. But yesterday, when I saw her, something awakened. A part of me I thought was lost. And I think it's time to repair what can still be repaired. Emily took her father's hand. Dad, we're with you. We can help him again. Sarah nodded vigorously. Yes. We have to do it. For the first time in years, Igor felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. Meeting Anna wasn't just an emotional shock, it was an opportunity, a chance to confront his past, heal, and perhaps rebuild a fractured family. And deep inside him, a glimmer of hope was rekindled. Perhaps this story was not just a tragedy, but the beginning of a reconciliation, a repair that neither time nor pain could prevent. A few days later, Igor finally decided to return to see Anna. The biting Chicago cold bit at his skin, but he felt nothing but the urgency of the moment. Emily and Sarah had accompanied him, silent but united, understanding that every step they took together brought them closer to a forgotten fragment of their family history. Anna sat in the same spot on the sidewalk, wrapped in her worn coat. Her gaze, at first surprised, softened when she recognized Igor. The encounter was fragile, almost unreal, as if time had stood still between them. Igor, she whispered, her voice broken by the years. I didn't know if I'd ever see you again. He knelt before her, his hands shaking slightly. I never forgot you, Anna. Even when I was furious, even when I didn't understand why you left. I knew you had been important. Anna bowed her head, letting a tear slide down her cheek. Things were complicated. After you left, I tried to find you, but life crushed me. I fell into poverty, into loneliness, and I didn't want you to see me like that. Igor gently took her hand, feeling all the fragility and pain accumulated in this small gesture. You should never have suffered alone. I looked for you in every success, but I realized that's not what matters. What matters is you and what we lost together. Emily and Sarah stood back, watching this scene with a mixture of astonishment and compassion. They now understood the depth of their father's wounds and realized that the beggar woman was not just a stranger, she was a part of their history, a living link to a past they were beginning to understand. Anna looked up and, for the first time in years, gave a weak smile. I'm so sorry, Igor. For everything you've been through, for everything we've lost. Igor felt his heart clench. The guilt and anger that had haunted him for so many years were beginning to dissolve in this simple exchange. This is not the time to talk about guilty or innocent, he replied softly. We have lost time, but we can still try to make up for it. He stood up, helping Anna to her feet, and his daughters came forward to offer her their hands. Together, they formed a fragile but comforting circle. The beggar, the woman who had suffered so much, now stood, surrounded by those who had sought her out and loved her without ever forgetting her. In that suspended moment, Igor understood something essential: the past could be painful, but it could also be repaired. Wounds, though deep, could begin to heal when truth and love united. And for the first time in a long time, Igor felt a glimmer of real hope, a future where suffering would be acknowledged, where forgiveness could exist, and where a broken family could finally begin to rebuild. The next day, Igor made a decision: he no longer wanted Anna's misery to define his life. With Emily and Sarah at his side, they developed a plan to help him regain a modicum of stability and dignity. They began by offering him clean, warm clothes. Anna accepted shyly, as if she didn't feel worthy of such attention. Emily, with her natural gentleness, helped him comb his hair and get rid of the dust and dirt that seemed to have accumulated over the years. Each gesture was a small miracle, and Igor felt a new emotion pass through him, pride mixed with guilt, the thought that he should have done it sooner. Dad. Sarah whispered, looking at Anna, she deserves so much better than this, she said with firm conviction. Igor nodded silently. He knew she was right. He had spent decades seeking success to escape his past, but now he understood that true success lay in repairing what he could still save. Then they temporarily moved her into a small apartment Igor had reserved for her. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, safe, and warm. Anna entered timidly, touching the furniture as if to make sure it was real and not a dream. I've never had a place like this, she whispered, her voice trembling. Igor sat down next to her and placed a hand on hers. This is your home now, Anna. You don't have to hide on the streets anymore, you don't have to suffer alone anymore. The girls, sitting on the couch, smiled shyly. They were beginning to understand that rebuilding their family was happening at this precise moment, at this attention paid to Anna and at the care they were taking to repair the wounds of the past. Yet despite the progress, Igor knew the road ahead would be long. The memories of his childhood, the pain of abandonment, and the years of anger and resentment would not disappear overnight. But he was ready to face these shadows, to confront them so that his family could find balance and a new peace. That evening, sitting around the kitchen table, Igor, Emily, Sarah, and Anna shared a simple but hearty meal. The conversations were timid, punctuated by silences, but everyone felt that something precious was being woven between them: trust, affection, and hope for a better future. This chapter of their lives marked the beginning of a slow but necessary reconstruction, where the wounds of the past began to heal under the watchful eye of those who truly loved them. Igor realized then that true courage lay not in material success, but in the ability to face one's past and reach out to those who had been lost. The following weeks were a mixture of sweetness and challenges. Anna was slowly beginning to return to a more stable rhythm of life, but the scars of the streets and years of suffering didn't disappear easily. Every sudden noise, every lingering glance on the street seemed to revive her painful memories. Igor, Emily, and Sarah did everything they could to offer her safety and comfort, but they understood that healing would take time. One evening, while they were all gathered in the living room, Igor felt uneasy. Anna seemed distracted, her gaze lost in space. Emily approached and placed her hand on the woman's shoulder. "Are you okay, Anna?" she asked softly. Anna shook her head. "It's just memories coming back. Things I tried to forget." Igor sat down next to her and took her hand. "You don't have to face them alone anymore, Anna. We're here." But the trials didn't end there. Igor's long-estranged family learned of Anna's existence. Some members reacted with skepticism and coldness, doubting the sincerity of this newly rediscovered beggar. Tensions erupted, and Igor was faced with a difficult choice: defend Anna and risk family conflict, or give in to the pressure and once again alienate her and his daughters. "Dad, we have to protect her," Sarah insisted. "We can't let the past decide her place in our family." Igor nodded, clenching his fists. "You're right. No one will hurt her. Not now, not after everything she's been through." Confronting his family made Igor realize how much he had changed. The man who once fled pain and conflict no longer existed. Now he was ready to confront not only his past, but also those who refused to see the truth. This ordeal strengthened the bond between Igor, his daughters, and Anna. Together, they decided to focus on what truly mattered: rebuilding the lives they had lost, creating a safe space where love and trust could exist, and learning to forgive those who had turned a blind eye for years. That evening, as they all sat around the table, a fragile but real sense of unity hung in the air. Igor felt for the first time in a long time that rebuilding his family was no longer just a dream, but a reality they were building, one step at a time. The next morning, light gently filtered into the apartment. For the first time in years, Igor felt a sense of true tranquility envelop him. Anna sat at the kitchen table, a hot coffee in her hands, and her eyes, though tired, shone with a new light, that of restored dignity. Emily and Sarah busied themselves preparing breakfast, laughing softly together. Igor watched them, his heart heavy but full of emotion. All around him, the house vibrated with a precious calm, a warmth he had never known as a child. "Dad," said Emily, placing a toast in front of him, "look how happy everyone is here." Igor smiled weakly, dropping the mask of strength and control he had worn for decades. He sat down at the table, taking Anna's hand and observing his daughters. "You're right," he said softly. "Today is a new beginning for all of us." Anna nodded, tears in her eyes, but a genuine smile lit up her face. "Thank you, Igor, for not leaving me alone this time." The girls exchanged a knowing look. They understood that their father, once so closed, had now found the courage to reconcile himself with his past and his wounds. In the days that followed, the family began to rebuild their lives around this newfound balance. Igor and Anna spent time bonding, sharing memories and hopes. The girls actively participated in this reconstruction, becoming pillars of support for their father and their newfound mother. One afternoon, as they were all walking together in the park where Igor had grown up, he stopped and looked at Anna, Emily, and Sarah. He breathed deeply, feeling the pain of the past ease. "We've been through a lot," he murmured. "But today, we're together. And that's true victory." Anna placed her hand on his arm. "And we will never leave each other again." Igor smiled, a full, genuine smile. For the first time in years, he felt whole. The weight of abandonment, poverty, and loneliness had transformed into strength, hope, and newfound love. As the sun set behind the buildings, bathing the park in a golden light, Igor understood a fundamental truth: the past could be painful, but reconciliation, love, and forgiveness could create a bright future. The family, once shattered by loss and suffering, was finally reunited, ready to face life together with courage, tenderness, and resilience. And in that moment of peace, Igor knew that, despite all the hardships, they had found what had been lost: a family, a home, and the promise of a future where everyone could exist fully, loved and respected. The next morning, a timid sun filtered through the curtains, illuminating the apartment with a soft, reassuring light. For the first time in years, Igor felt a real sense of tranquility envelop him. Anna sat at the kitchen table, holding a steaming cup of coffee. Her eyes, tired but filled with a newfound light, reflected a restored dignity and renewed hope. Emily and Sarah busied themselves with breakfast, laughing softly, exchanging knowing glances. Igor watched them, his heart heavy but warmed by emotion. All around him, the house finally vibrated with a warmth he had never known as a child. "Dad, look, everyone is happy here," said Emily, placing a toast in front of him. Igor smiled weakly, dropping the mask of strength and control he had worn for decades. He sat down at the table, taking Anna's hand, and observed his daughters. "You're right," he said softly. "Today marks a new beginning for all of us." Anna nodded, a tear rolling down her cheek, but a genuine smile lit up her face. "Thank you, Igor, for not leaving me alone this time." The girls exchanged a knowing look. They understood that their father, once so closed, had found the courage to come to terms with his past and his wounds. In the days that followed, the family began rebuilding their lives around this newfound balance. Igor and Anna shared moments of complicity, recounting memories and hopes, while Emily and Sarah became pillars of support for their father and mother. Every laugh, every tender gesture, every word of encouragement strengthened the fragile but real bond that united them. One afternoon, as they were walking in the park where Igor had grown up, he stopped and looked at Anna, Emily, and Sarah. He breathed deeply, feeling the pain of the past ease and transform into strength and gratitude. "We've been through a lot," he murmured, "but today we're together. And that's true victory." Anna placed her hand on his arm gently. "And we will never leave each other again." Igor finally smiled, fully, a liberated and sincere smile. For the first time in years, he felt whole. The weight of abandonment, poverty, and loneliness had transformed into love, resilience, and hope. As the sun set behind the buildings, bathing the park in a warm, golden light, Igor understood a vital truth: the past can be painful, but reconciliation, love, and forgiveness can create a bright future. The family, once shattered by absence and hurt, was finally reunited. Together, they were ready to face life with courage, tenderness, and determination. They had regained what had been lost: a home, a deep connection, and the promise of a future where everyone could live fully, loved and respected. And in that moment of peace, Igor knew that, despite all the trials, they had finally found the light that would guide their path forever.